In this project, we are using MVC architecture, and after the MVC architecture, we are using the Maven tool. So Maven tool is used to create a build of a project. Also, it will help us to manage the resources of the project, the third-party resources. So when we create a Maven project, automatically it will create us a Maven file form.xml, that is a configuration file of the project. Here we are managing the third-party APIs. For example, we are using the MySQL as the third parties are. So we have a dependency for the MySQL. We are using Servlet. So we have a Servlet. We are using Log4j. So accordingly, whatever the third-party tools we are using in this project, we have to add the dependency. This dependency define the definition of that particular technology. Let's suppose if we are using Servlet, we have to add the Servlet API. Jar will be displayed here, and then we can use all the classes, all the functionality of Servlet. Okay. Another thing, the important thing is the MVC architecture. So this project is using MVC architecture, and MVC defines a process into a three different parts. So MVC refers a model view controller. Okay. So how the flow is working over there. So MVC contain three-part: model, view, and controller. Model will be totally responsible to handle the database transactions. Similarly, the view part has come under the user visibility, like whatever the user can see or you guys can see over the screen in the project. From the user side, all that elements, web elements, it can be web elements, it can be link, label, text, all these things will come under the view part. A controller is a mediator for a view and model, so it is going to use or handle the request and responses. So how the real-time project or the like real-time process will work, uh, we can send as a user, we send a request to the controller, then controller send same request to the model, then model send the response to controller, and then controller send response back to the view. Now, how can we define these things in a technology wise? So we have HTML, JSP, CSS that come under the view part. For controller, we have a servlet and JSP. For MySQL, for database side, we have a MySQL. So let's take an example of login. So when you as a user, when we enter a username, password, hit the login button, the data in the form of request will send to the controller. Controller means it will send to the servlet. Servlet will check the data is valid or not. Then the data will come in a different properties, like a user data can come into the properties of username, first name, last name, email ID, and this. So the controller will convert the data into a single object, and then this data will be that object will be sent to the model. Again, model have a responsibility to check the data connections and the availability of the data as a login user, and then the model will send data back to the controller. So controller will get that response from the model. Accordingly, it will perform the operation. If it is a valid user, then it will be redirect to the welcome page. Otherwise, it will send a error message to view that data is not a valid username or password. Okay, so you can go through with its documents also in depth. So now how we are implementing this MVC into our project. System. Can you please share your screen again? I lost the connection, please. Can you please share the screen again? Hello. Please share your screen again. Allow me access. Okay, now we'll see how can we implement this thing into our real-time project. So here is an example also available. So this is our demo project. So all the data will come under the web folder like CSS, image, JSP, HTML things will come under the view part. For controller, we have a separate package. For the model, we have a separate package to handle the database transactions. Okay. So before I go for the projects, anyone have a question related to the tools and technology or things that we are using or we just address up? No? Okay. So here, if I explore this application, we have multiple folders are there. So let's explore them one by one. So first I have a bean here. So bean is used to get or set a property for a particular object. So this is it's responsible to convert to get and set the values. So this is a concept of the encapsulation, you can say, where we are separating the entities into a single object. We are wrapping the entities a property of an entity into a single object. So all the beans will be there according to the modules, like for the user beans, for the users, we have a separate bean, for the result, we have a bean. So every module of the application will contain a separate bean, and this is a help to define the property of the module and provide to write the data and setters for it. Another thing we have as a controller. So controller will be, you can see the bean format here. So it has only get and set methods for the properties that we've just defined. Under the controller part, all the servlets are there. So for each module, we have a different servlet. So the servlet will be responsible to take response and get request and send the response back to the model of bean. So this is the mediator, and after the mediator we can, okay, you can write down your questions. I will give you a chance once I will finish the session. You can ask me at the time. Okay, is there any technical issue?
No, nothing.
Okay, so controller will be used to handle the request and responses. After that we have an exception, so that exception will help us to uh, create or handle the exception, that is the predefined, that is whatever the risky code we are using. So there are majorly 4 types of exception, and these are the predefined exceptions classes, so that we are just using into the application from the Java library. So this is the application exception, database exception, there might be a duplicate record exception, there might be record not found. So this is just predefined code, we are nothing doing much here. Another model, so model is a responsible to handle the database transaction. So for each module we have a separate model here. So model will be responsible to handle CRUD operation of the application. So we have each and every transaction contain a method. So let's, for example, we need to add the data, we have a add method. We need to update the data, we have a update method here related to the user model. Under the util we have some helper classes just going to help us. So first classes we have as a data utility. This data utility class will help me to convert the data and get the data according to my requirement. So let's suppose it has some data, get data. So it take a string as a input and return a date. So it will convert a string value into a date. Similarly, we have a get string, so it will take a string value as a date value and convert it to the string. So whatever the conversion I required, I have this small methods are there. It will help me during the programming over the server. Data validator will help us to validate the data. So let's suppose when we want to validate a name, is name or not. So we are using the regex format. So these are the methods that is going to use to validate the data. Other thing, we have a HTML like a JDBC data source that help us to create a connection with database and close the connection, rollback on all the transactions to create a connection. It's not performing any transaction related to the data. It's just creating connection with the database, that is a third party application. Under the property readers, we are reading the data from the configuration file. Each project contains a configuration file that is called system.property. So from that file, we need to read the data. And in this project, the file is contained into the resources folder. So if you open it at the end under the bundle, you will get the system.property. It contains a configuration file related to the database configuration and other things. You can see the URL have a key and it has a value. Again, it has a key as a value. So whenever I need to read this data, I will call this method get value and pass my key, and it will return me a value. All the things will be, all the connection and all the object creation thing will be responsible by this method. Servlet utility over the servlet. This is the helper class for the servlets. So over the servlet, what I need to do, I need to forward the request. Sometime I need to redirect the request. Sometime with a request, I need to send some messages, some error messages, some success messages. So here we have all the custom methods that will help us to perform the transactions from the database, from the server side, from the servlet. So whenever I need to perform any transaction, I will call these methods over there. Okay, under the view part, we have under the web part, we have a CSS that is completely used for the styling or makeover of element. And if we are using any specific font into the project, we can keep the font in this project. In this folder, we are using images, JavaScript, and the most important JSP. So all the JSPs will come under the JSP folder, and in this JSP file, we can write the HTML codes. Again, we have a web INF that contain our web.xml where we are mapping the welcome file. So our welcome file is welcome view.jsp. So whenever the project will run, this file will be open first, and the pond.xml is already there. Now, if you have any question, you can ask me before we go for the flow. Okay.
Sir, I doesn't understand what does like the bean means. Like you have given user bean, exam bean. Like, what is the difference between bean and the controller?
Controller bean is converting an entity, attribute of an entity into an object, and controller is handling the request and responses from the server side. Like controller is a mediator. Those are the two different things. Like so controller is handled by the servlets, and the beans are in the core Java simple. So core Java, the beans are converting a single entity property of an entity into an object, and controllers are handling the request and responses. Request coming from the view part and sending to the model.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Any other question from anyone? No? Should I go for the flow? Okay, so we'll see the complete flow of the login registration, because these the two modules that cover the complete transaction and complete process of MVC, where we are while we are logging the data into the application, we are selecting some data from the database, and while we are registering in the application, we are inserting the data. So all other modules also use the same format, and each and every module will follow the same model, which is a model view controller. If you are working in any enterprises application, just note down the model view controller. So how the model view controller is implemented into the real time, let's see. So here we have a login.view.jsp. If you have a basic knowledge of the HTML contains a form. When users submit that form, the data will be sent to the controller. So currently we are on the view. Our view is this form. When user will submit this data, user will enter the username, password, all the fields are there. Enter the login ID, enter the password, and hit the submit button. When user will submit the button, according to the MVC, the data will be sent to the controller. So you can see here over the action, we are sending the data to the controller. So now view part is end. Now the job start for the controller. We have from the view, we have collected the data. We have sent the data to the controller. Now the login controller will handle the request, and it will hit to the post method. So now go to the controller, and let's see how the login controller is working there. So here we have a file with that same name, login controller. Under the login controller, the first as a login controller, the first job will be validate the data. So I'm validating the data here. So to validate the data, I will take help from the util package which contain the data validator. So I will validate the each and every field that is coming from the front end, from the view part, and then I will populate the data. Here exactly I'm using the bean. Exactly I'm converting this object, these small values like username and the password into an object. So how I'm converting this? I just created object of a user bean. Then I know in user bean I have a values to set and get the IDs, get the different properties. So here I've created an object of user bean and I set the ID that is coming from the front end after the validating. And then I have set the login, I have set the password, and it will return me a single object. Again, as the data is coming from the front end and it's hitting to the post method, so the controller will send to the do post method. And then now I have validated the data, I have populated the data. Now my job is to the data is valid now, and now I can send this data to controller to model. So here in the post method, I've created an object of user model, and then I have called the populated data. So now this bean will contain the populated data. And again, from the model object, from the model class, I'm calling the authentication method. So model have all the methods that perform the transaction with the database. So I've called the authentication method. Under the authentication method, we are passing the username and the password. Now the controller part is also done. Now the job start from the model part. So now what the model will do, let's move to the authentication and then we'll come to the controller again. So again, if you open the model, for each and every module we have a separate model. So it's redirected to the user model, and here is the authentication method. What this method is doing, now the data is come to view to controller, controller to model. Now what model will do, model will get a connection from the database, and then connection definition is defined into the JDBC data source that is available under the util package. It will create a connection, it will fire a query, select a stick from the table name where login and ID is this, and accordingly it will return a response from over there, and after that at the end it will close the connection. So if it is a valid user, it will send a valid response. If it is an invalid user, it will send an invalid response. That response will be handled by again the controller. Like the model part is also done. Model check the data, model get the data, model check that create connection with the database, check the data, and send the response back to the login controller. Now this bean have that response that is coming from the model, and now it will check a condition bean. If that bean is not null, then create a login controller and the timer for that particular user to be logging into the application and redirect to the welcome user. Otherwise it will send a message. uh, if you notice, you can check here, we are calling the messages from the servlet utility. That is again a helper of a helper for the servlet. So under the servlet utility we are calling servlet utility dot set error message. If the user is not valid, if response is coming invalid from the database, it will send invalid login and password. Okay, again, this data will be sent. Let's suppose it's a valid user, and the data will be sent to the welcome user, and the welcome page will be displayed. Otherwise, in case of any error, the response will be sent back to the login page and show them there is an error or username and the password is not valid. So we'll display that message over the login view.jsp. So now we'll check another module. This is a complete flow of a login process. So we'll check the another module also. So let's check the registration. Okay, user registration. So as I told you, each and every module will follow the same process. So for the registration also, process will be same. Like we have a view registration here. Over the view registration, we have a form. So here, when this form will be submitted, the data will be sent to the user controller. So you can see here the form action is user controller and it will hit to the post method. Now this complete data, when user enter the username, password, all the detail, the data will be sent to the user controller. And here we have a user registration controller, and this user registration controller will take the data, will validate the data, and the same process as we have done into the login time. After that, it will populate the data. It means convert that entities into a single object, and then it will hit to the post method. It will get the data and send data to the model part. Let me show you where is the model. And from the model part, it will call the add method. Here we are populating the data and we are creating an object of model again, and this time we are not calling authentication, this time we are calling user registration method. So under the registration method, all the data is written over there. Similarly, we have created a connection with a database, and we have created a connection with a database, and we have fired some queries, and after the firing queries, it will send the data to the database, and the data that response will be come again to the controller. The data is registered or not as a successfully. So whatever the response will come to the controller, controller will check that response and store the value into a pk, and accordingly as per the condition it will send the message. Like for example, if you register successfully, it will send a success message, user is registered successfully. Otherwise it will read, you know, return the some invalid data or some login ID, whatever the error should be there, it will send the error accordingly. So now this controller again go to the view, and it will display the message accordingly. It can be success, it can be a fail. So here we are handling the that messages. So get error message that is coming from the servlet utilities. So this is a complete flow. All each and every modules are using the same format, even for the category and for go for the any of the module. These are the using the same format. Model view controller, we are sending the data from view to controller. Controller will validate the data, populate the data, send to the model. Model will get the data and connect with the database, perform the transaction according to the request, send response back to the controller, and controller will send back response to the view part. In case you have any question, you can ask me now. I'm done with the session from my side.